When equity is positioned as the enemy of merit, we need to be willing to question what has historically been treated as merit in the first place. Because a system can claim to reward merit while actually rewarding, hear me when I say this, proximity to whiteness.
We are represented. We are represented. We are represented.
Welcome to Represented, the podcast. I'm Aniki Shuru, racial equity coach for online business owners who want to be intentionally inclusive by building a business that is racially equitable. I created this podcast to normalize a conversation around racial inclusion so that fear is no longer the barrier that gets in the way of doing this work. This isn't about perfection, it's about progress. Whether you're taking your first steps or you're well-versed in the journey towards racial equity, this space is for you. So welcome home, friend. Let's get started.
From coast to coast, around the globe, we are represented. We are represented. We are represented.
Hey, welcome back to another episode of Represented Podcast. Thank you so much for tuning in. Now, today I want to talk about the difference between equity and equality because I think this is one of those conversations that sounds simple until you really begin to kind of sit with it. And a lot of people hear the word equality and immediately connect it with fairness. And I understand why, because many of us were taught from a young age that fairness means treating everyone the same, giving everyone the same opportunity, holding everyone to the same standard, and making sure no one is singled out. On the surface, that can sound reasonable, right? Even kind. But when we are talking about racism, discrimination, and the long history of exclusion that has shaped access to things like education, housing, land, employment, leadership, business ownership, wealth, and even safety, treating everyone the same does not automatically create fairness. And this matters so much right now because we are living through a time where words like equity, inclusion, diversity, and DEI are being deliberately distorted. In the United States, especially, we're seeing equity initiatives being framed as though they give Black and brown people an unfair advantage, as though the work of addressing discrimination is somehow discriminatory itself. That framing is not only inaccurate, it is deeply misleading because it removes the historical and structural conditions that made equity necessary in the first place. If someone only hears the current backlash without understanding the history, it becomes very easy to believe that equity is a modern political trend or a form of preferential treatment. But when you trace the story back, equity has always been connected to the reality that equal treatment in unequal conditions does not produce equal outcomes. Now, let me say that again. Equal treatment in unequal conditions does not produce equal outcomes. And so today, my friend, I want to break this down for you. I want to explain the difference between equality and equity, looking at where this thinking comes from historically and speaking to some of the false narratives shaping how DEI is being discussed right now. Then, in part two, because this is just part one, and this is a big conversation, and I wanted to have the opportunity to break it down and for us to go through it step by step, but to give you enough, not just to kind of tease you, but to really give you enough so that you can stand on the understanding of what equity truly is and what equality is, and be able to, especially as an online business owner, know what direction to take your business in, especially if you're somebody who is wanting to build a business that is equitable. So, part two, we will bring this closer to home by looking at Australia's own racial history and what this means for the online coaching industry. Because if you are a coach, consultant, creative, somebody who creates courses, or somebody who hosts memberships, and you genuinely want to build a more inclusive business, you will know that this conversation is nowhere close to being theoretical. It has everything to do with practicality, with the spaces we hold, the offers we create, and the client experiences we design and are constantly designing. So let's begin with the simplest distinction. Equality is usually concerned with sameness, the same rules, the same access, having the same opportunity, the same treatment. Equity is more concerned with fairness in context. It looks at the actual conditions people are navigating and considers what it may be required for fairness to be experienced in real life, not only promised in theory. So, equality might mean everyone is invited to the room, while equity pays closer attention to who knew the room existed in the first place, who felt safe enough to enter, who had already been welcomed into similar rooms before, who had the language and confidence to, engage and participate, who was believed once they spoke because there was something about them that was credible in how they were viewed, and who, in contrast, was carrying the memory of being dismissed in rooms just like it. That's where sameness can become inadequate, because sameness assumes everyone has the same starting point. And we know that is not true. Some people move through the world with inherited access, inherited trust, inherited proximity to power, networks, financial stability, assumptions of competence. Others move through the world having to overcome racial stereotypes, accent bias, visa restrictions, lower family wealth, cultural isolation, the pressure of being the first, and the experience of being seen as potentially risky, difficult, a bit too much, not enough, or not quite the right fit. So when we treat both groups exactly the same and call it fairness, we may actually be protecting the conditions that created the inequality to begin with. One of the images often used to explain this is the fence analogy, and I use this to illustrate it to my students as well. This is where different people are trying to see over a fence, and these people are of different height, right? And Equality gives everyone the same box to stand on, meaning that box is the same height. So everyone is being given that regardless of their height. While equity gives each person the support they need to see over the fence. And so, if you are a shorter person, that means that maybe you might not need the one box that's been given to others. You might need two or three boxes. And it can be a helpful starting point when you're thinking about equity and equality. But when we're talking about race, I think we need to go deeper because racial inequity is not simply about people being different heights. Yeah. The issue is also who built the fence, who owns the land behind it, who was pushed away from it, who had the land taken, who was told they were trespassing, who inherited the access passed down from generation to generation, who was given a map, who was protected by the people guarding the entrance, and in contrast, who was questioned before they even got close enough to see what was on the other side. That is why equity cannot be reduced to being nice or giving people extra help. Equity is a response to real social and historical conditions. It recognizes that racism has not only operated through individual prejudice, although it certainly has, racism has also operated through laws, policies, institutions, cultural norms, hiring practices. And as somebody who has a background in human resource management and having been in that for over 15 years, I am very aware of hiring practices and how inequitable they can be. Education systems, the housing markets, because there's certain suburbs that are reserved for the wealthy and others for the who come from socially low economic status. The business networks, who are we connected to? Who do we know who might be able to open a door? Media representation, what are we being shown? And assumptions about who is credible, who is intelligent, professional, safe, desirable, or worthy of investment. So when people come into a space today, they are not arriving simply as individuals. And so when somebody comes into your coaching space, they're not just coming as an individual. They are arriving with all the ways history has shaped what they have access to, what they have been denied, what they have had to learn in order to survive, and what they have been taught to expect from spaces led by people who may not share their lived experience. This is why the phrase, just treat everyone the same, can feel reassuring to the person who has not had to think deeply about racialized barriers, while feeling very inadequate to the person who has lived with those barriers. It can sound fair, but it often fails to account for the fact that discrimination has always been unevenly distributed. The harm has not been the same, nor the barriers, the risks, or the access. So the response cannot always be identical and still be fair. Now, this is not a new idea. In international human rights law, There has long been recognition that certain groups may require specific measures in order to enjoy rights and freedoms equally. The International Convention on the Elimination of All Forms of Racial Discrimination, adopted by the United Nations back in 1965, includes the concept of special measures for racial or ethnic groups who require protection or advancement so they can enjoy human rights and freedoms equally. These measures are not considered racial discrimination where they are designed for that purpose and not continued after their objectives have been achieved. And if you have listened to episode 99 of the podcast, 60 years on from IDERD, this connects directly to that conversation because it gives us important language for understanding why equity measures are not the same as unfair preference. They exist because there are situations where equal enjoyment of rights cannot be achieved through equal treatment alone. That is an incredibly important point because it shows us that equity is not the opposite of equality. It is often one of the ways societies attempts to move towards meaningful equality. It recognizes that sometimes different treatment is necessary because the conditions people are living under are different. If a group has been systemically excluded from education, housing, employment, leadership, voting, land ownership, or public life, then simply announcing that everyone is now treated the same does not undo the effects of that exclusion at all. It may change the language of the system, but it does not necessarily change who has power, who has resources, trust, wealth, networks, and who is still trying to enter spaces that were never originally built with them in mind in the first place. This is part of what shaped affirmative action in the United States. This is a phrase that became really prominent in the 1960s when President JFK signed an Executive Order 10925, which required government contractors to take affirmative action to ensure applicants were employed and employees were treated without regard to race, creed, color, or national origin. And then a few years later, in 1965, President Johnson signed Executive Order 11246. And I'm saying this number for a reason, stay with me, which strengthened equal employment opportunity obligations for federal contractors. Then in January 2025, President Trump revoked Executive Order 11246, the one that President Johnson signed into effect. That was revoked in January 2025 through an executive order titled Ending Illegal Discrimination and Restoring Merit-Based Opportunity. Now, I want us to pay attention to the language because language is doing the most here. Merit-based opportunity sounds reasonable, right? Most people want skill, experience, contribution, and competence to matter. I do too. But the problem is that merit is often spoken about as though it exists outside of social conditions, when in reality, what gets recognized as merit has always been shaped by access. Who was mentored early? Who was encouraged to apply for that position? Who had family members who knew how to move through professional systems or were part of those professional systems? Who had access to unpaid internships? Who could afford to take risks? Who was given feedback instead of being written off? Who was described as confident, while someone else with the same behavior was described as aggressive? Who had a name, accent, hairstyle, body, or cultural presentation that was already considered professional? When equity is positioned as the enemy of merit, we need to be willing to question what has historically been treated as merit in the first place. Because a system can claim to reward merit while actually rewarding, hear me when I say this, proximity to whiteness, inherited wealth, elite education, cultural familiarity, existing networks, and forms of communication that have already been normalized by the dominant group. That does not mean individual effort does not matter. It means individual effort is never operating in isolation. People work hard inside conditions that either support them, obstruct them, or require far more of them than others can see. This is where the current backlash against DEI becomes so concerning. Equity is being misrepresented as unfair advantage. And once that narrative takes hold, people begin to look at any attempt to address exclusion with suspicion. A scholarship is looked at with suspicion. A leadership pathway, a hiring initiative, a commitment to diverse representation, a program designed to support people who have historically been locked out of opportunity, all of it can be framed as though it is stealing opportunity from others. And once that happens, the original injustice disappears from the conversation. The focus shifts away from the racial exclusion that created the gap and moves towards resentment over the measures designed to address it. Now, for a lot of white business owners, especially those who are values led and genuinely trying to do good, this can feel confusing. You might hear one side saying equity is necessary, another side saying equity is discrimination. And if you do not have the historical grounding, you may find yourself unsure of what to believe. That uncertainty is part of why this episode matters so much, because false narratives are powerful when they meet people who care but do not yet have enough context to discern what is being distorted. So, as we bring part one of this conversation to a close, I want you to chew on this. If we do not understand the history of inequity, it becomes very easy to believe false narratives about equity. And right now, when DEI is being misbranded, equity is being treated as suspicious, and inclusion work is being framed as though it's unfair to address unfairness. We need more than headlines. We need historical context. We need the ability to recognize when the language of fairness is being used to protect conditions that were never fair to begin with. This is exactly why I do the work I do inside Represented. Because if you are an online business owner who cares about racial equity, inclusion, and representation, you need the historical grounding and the support to look honestly at the spaces you are creating and the people who may still be left out, even when you never intended for that to happen. Represented is my 10-week program for online business owners who want to integrate racial equity, inclusion, and representation into the heart of their business. Inside the program, we'll look at your lens, your leadership, your messaging, your offers, your client experience, the community spaces, and ways bias can show up in both human decision making and AI assisted systems. So, if today's episode has helped you realize that you are ready to move beyond good intentions and begin doing this work with more depth, support, and accountability, I would love to invite you to join the waitlist for Represented. You can head over to anigishu.com/represented and get your name on the waitlist. That link is in the show notes. Now, next week, in part 2, we're going to bring this conversation closer to home. We will look at Australia's own racial history, why equity is not just an American conversation, and then we will bring it directly into the online coaching industry because this is where the conversation becomes deeply practical for the businesses we are building, the spaces we are holding, and the client experiences we are designing.
We are represented. We are represented. We are represented.
Thank you so much for tuning in. Why don't you go ahead and hit that subscribe button and leave a review so this podcast can reach more online business owners, and together we can begin to normalize racial inclusion in the online coaching space. I'd love to acknowledge the traditional owners of the land where this podcast episode was recorded, the Wiradjuri people in central New South Wales, Australia. Music produced in Nairobi, Kenya by Patrick St. P. Mbaru and Kambua Mathu. Vocals by Joanne Matata.